Mary Helen balances her time between her work as an author, healer, and seminar facilitator with helping her girls to develop the unique metaphysical skills and gifts which they too have been blessed with. Mary currently resides in the village of Brideswell, Athlone in Ireland, and she travelled to Dublin to meet bases and give her very detailed assessment of her car accident, which riddled her with a host of injuries, and her out-of-body experience.
Hi Mary.
Hello.
Welcome to the Basis Project, and we're in Ireland. And you come the whole way over from the United States to Ireland for different experiential reasons, but you've also had an out-of-body or near-death experience. Mm-hmm. So this is added to your experience. So tell us all about your experiences.
Okay, well for me, it started when I was actually in the womb, and my mother was pregnant with me and had the German measles. She had rubella, and she and my father were told that I was not going to be okay, that I was going to have some type of handicap, deformity, issues with hearing, seeing. And my father had a visit from what he described as a celestial being.
Uh-huh.
Now, my father
We're going straight into the aliens.
My father was a Southern Baptist minister, and it was interesting that he didn't use the term within his religious confines. He did not use the term angel. He used celestial being, because I don't think it was something he could describe.
The so-called ET thing is an assumption. There's nothing here, so it must be up there, mm-hmm. or from another world. Mm-hmm. Explain what all that is, and your father's background.
Okay, so my father, being a minister, he would have had a certain set of parameters of belief, and when this being, that he called it, visited, he was told that his little girl, and they didn't know what I was going to be at that stage, that his little girl was going to be okay, that she would be physically well, but that she was going to come in with some different abilities. And from that day forward, my father knew that I was going to be okay, and sure enough, when I was born with no complications from the German measles, which was quite unusual and very unexpected. And I think it would be debatable whether I'm normal or not, but I came out okay from that experience. And so from the time as long as I can remember, my father always used to tell me I was promised, and this is where the title of my first book came from, Promised.
What does that mean? That's a special meaning.
So for my dad, it was, anytime something would go wrong for me, or if I was down, or if I had trouble with something, he would sit me down and he'd go, "Remember, you are promised." And so I finally started asking, what does that mean? And so he described, then what had happened. And it was always a celestial being. Those were his words. And I thought that was so fascinating, because I would have been growing up then going to church, where I would have been hearing about angels and hearing about different things, that would have been religious type of icons, and celestial being never really came up. And so my father had also been told, which they chose not to really discuss, that I would have some unusual capabilities. So by the time I was, say, 3-4 years old, I would come bouncing in and report to my parents about these wonderful conversations that I had with my grandfather, who was my mother's father, and he was named Judge. Judge was a surgeon from Kentucky, and a very well-revered surgeon in his field, and he would have these amazing conversations with me about healing, about being a steward of humanity, very meaty conversations to be having with a very small child. My role here, how I was to serve, what I was to use my gifts for, that he had the same gifts, and that we were here to help. We were here to move mankind forward. And so I would talk to my parents about these conversations, and I'd get these really funny looks. And it was at this stage that my parents sat me down and said, are you able to understand the difference between what it means to be alive or dead? And I said, I don't know what you mean. And my grandfather, Judge, had been dead since I was 1. And so these conversations that I was having with him, to me, seemed like I was having the same conversation with you. To me, he looked real, he was tangible, he was there, he was a presence. I could communicate freely back and forth, but then my parents realized that I'm speaking to someone who wasn't in a body. So my childhood was quite interesting that way. I was having prophetic dreams. I was having, I would always know when somebody was going to die, and I would tell my parents, which was actually very helpful with my father since he was writing the town's eulogies and as the local minister. And, as I got older, my parents didn't want me to be exploited in any way. So I was always told, we don't talk about this outside of us. We didn't even discuss it with my siblings. So it was funny, when my first book came out, a whole lot of information that came out was a real shock to a portion of my family, because my father was very, very diligent about the fact that he knew something strange was going on. He knew that my purpose and my mission was out of the ordinary, and he was trying very hard to keep me protected from anybody who might take advantage of that. Or
what kind of minister was that relevant, do you feel?
What was my father?
Yeah.
Christian, just Southern Baptist Christian minister.
Right, okay. Baptist, but in other words, it wasn't angelic, it wasn't demonic, it was a celestial. This is a big...
Oh yeah, yeah. And they wouldn't have been what we call in the South, in the Bible Belt, the holy rollers, do you know, where you're up in the pulpit screaming the hellfire and brimstone. My father was a very motivational speaker. So, while yes, Christianity, talks about heaven and hell, we never really talked about the hell aspect. We always shot for the positive outcome. And, we discussed heaven an awful lot more than we discussed hell, and my father was a motivator. So it wasn't coming from any kind of, we wouldn't have been kind of cultist, or we wouldn't have been fundamentalist, or we wouldn't have been the holy roller type who would be, the demonic beings and the angelic presence. That just wasn't part of what I was growing up with. So, we were all dealing with things that were new for us. I didn't come with a manual.
Growth, that's just...
Oh, I'm very, 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 very blessed. It was lonely because I couldn't talk about what was happening to me except for to my parents, and my parents didn't really know how to digest it. It certainly wasn't fitting into their box.
A hugely protective and very wise step to do.
I do too. I do too.
You knew that you weren't bonkers. You knew it wasn't strange that a lot of other experiences have.
Right.
You had the sanctity and safety of your parents.
Exactly. So, all throughout my teenage years and into college, Judge would, he was advising me, constantly talking to me. But by the time I got into college, it was very interesting because I was a cheerleader in college, and the extent of me utilizing my gifts of knowing things before they would happen and having any kind of dreams was, I would write down the scores of the basketball game. I'd stick it in an envelope and put it in the top drawer. And my roommate and I would go off, we'd cheer at the basketball game, everybody would come back to our room, we'd crack open a beer, open the envelope, and there was the score of the game, and everybody would just die laughing. And so this was the extent of how I was serving humanity. And when I turned 21, I had moved to Charleston, South Carolina, and it was in this move and in this time, 6 months following graduation, that I was getting ready to get a big fat kick in the butt from the universe, set up by myself, that if I had reached adulthood and I wasn't utilizing these wonderful gifts that I had come here with, that I was going to get a very big wake-up call. And so on December 14th, 1991, I was driving to a Christmas party. It was hot in Charleston. I was wearing Bermuda shorts and a Santa Claus t-shirt and a Jingle Bell necklace. And I was about 2 miles away from home, and I was crossing an intersection, and 6 lanes this way, 6 lanes this way, big intersection. And I had made it all the way across after sitting at a red light, across 5 of those 6 lanes. And an elderly gentleman blew through a red light, and he T-boned me at 75 miles an hour. And the interesting thing was, just prior, and remember, I'm on the left side in the car in America, so he's going to make a direct hit into me. And I looked, and I knew in that moment that I was getting ready to die. And what was very interesting was, as soon as I had that recognition, everything slowed down. You hear about this, it happened, time warped right there. And everything slowed down, and I was watching the car just inching towards me. I knew I was going to die, but suddenly I became aware of the fact that I had a choice. I had done this before. I mean, this is all brand new to me. I wasn't raised to believe that, And I had a choice. I could stay in the body and feel the impact if I needed that for my tool basket, or I could exit the body before the car actually hit me. So I could actually leave the form before that car knocked me. And I chose to leave. You know, I was very aware that I had died many times before. And I can't say 5 minutes before that I'd been very aware of anything like that. But in that moment, I knew this was routine. This is what you do. This is how you get out of a body. It's not a big deal. And so I chose to leave. And so the very second I did, there was this drone. I play Irish music. I play the bodhrán. And so I love the Ilian pipes, you know, and when they're getting ready to play, there's a drone that comes out of the pipes, kind of a low frequency vibration. And that's the sound that I could describe that was in the background, this low frequency vibration. And I've come years later to recognize that that's the sound when the spirit is leaving the confines of the flesh. The vibration has to elevate in order for the spirit to actually get out of the body. And so when you're still connected to the earth plane, it's actually quite a low vibration. It's a low drone. I'll never forget the sound. And so I'm watching as I have exited the body. I'm looking down now and everything speeds up instantly. And boom, I watch the car hit my car. Literally fold the car in half. It's spinning through the intersection. You know, you're watching people in horror. The car is coming through and it comes to a stop. My head's gone through the window and back in again. Glass is shattered everywhere. My seat is folded up under me and I look like a little puppet. And I was kind of just hanging into the seat. And I was like, oh, how interesting. And at that stage, I didn't even have an attachment to the body. Do you know, I was like, I wasn't grieving the loss. I wasn't, oh my God, you know. The way I have described it that I think sits best with most people is if you can picture being outside working in the garden and it's hot and you're sweaty and you're nasty and you're dirty and you come in your back door and you peel off those dirty clothes and you leave them by the washing machine. You go upstairs and you get in the most beautiful hot shower and you're cleansing yourself and you're washing. The very last thing you're thinking about is your dirty clothes next to the washing machine. This is what it's like when you leave the body. Do you know, it's that you don't pine away for it. You're not clamoring to get back in. It's just not like that. At least in my experience, it wasn't. And there's that body sitting there. It's now come to a halt. It turns out a girl that I'd gone to college with was 2 cars behind me. The interesting thing was I could feel her horror when she recognized that that was me in that car. There's hundreds of people around now at this stage. People are getting out of cars because all the traffic has come to a standstill. She comes running up. I could feel her heartbeat. I could just feel her terror. And, but still no concern or attachment for my body. And suddenly I realized, oh, I know who I am. And after all of my life having these wonderful kind of, strange experiences and the dreams and the speaking with the dead and this thing, I was still human. In the back of my mind, there was always this fear, what happens if I cease to exist? That idea that, you die and boom, that's it. You don't matter anymore. You were snuffed out, nothing left. And in that moment, I remember so distinctly going, oh, I still know who I am. I remembered being Mary Helen, but then all of a sudden I was starting to remember other things. And I'm watching as I'm remembering at the same time, and I see a man in a uniform come in and reach through the passenger side because all the windows are blown out, and he's turned the engine of the car off. He's trying to get the door open, but it's crushed against my body. I'm seeing a lady came over and put her name and phone number into the passenger seat of the car and then ran off. Very weird things, And so I watched this, and all of a sudden that low drone begins to speed up, and it got higher and higher, and it turned into the most beautiful sound I have ever heard. Certainly have never heard anything since. I call it the music of the spheres, and it sped up. And as it sped up, I sped up too. I know that sounds strange, but it was like every core particle of my being started moving faster. And this is where people always ask, did you go through the tunnel of light? Well, I went through, but it was so fast, I don't even remember. It was like I was here one minute, and then I was here the next. And so I find myself in this surrounding that, again, all these years later, there are no words. How do you describe something that is so beautiful that it hurts to remember? It's this amazing space where you can touch the atmosphere. It was palpable. You could breathe it, feel it. Every part of it was coursing, through your being. It was that you were a part of this. And I was just sitting in the space and I'm going, oh, I'm home, Was I thinking about that body? Absolutely not. Was I thinking about the fact that I'd just been killed in an accident? No, absolutely not. I was so overjoyed to be in this space and I just felt, oh, I'm back. Oh, I'm here. Oh, I recognize this. This is wonderful. So the challenge of being in the confines of five senses and the meat wagon, it was over. It was a relief. It was, whew, So I'm in that space and I'm soaking it up. And next thing, out of the atmosphere, which was, like I said, it was palpable. You could touch the air. It began to take shape. And these two beings stepped forward. Now remember, I'm coming from a Southern Baptist background. I've been taught a kind of a rote version of what happens to one when one dies. You may meet Jesus or you may meet your family members that, and they'll take you into the light and you'll sit on the right hand of God forever, which when you look back, I'm like, really, people, that's it? And does anybody ask any questions? What happens to you after that? Like when you just walk the streets paved in gold back and forth, what happens after that, And I get in here and these two beings step forward and I'm looking at them and Miles, you're getting like me, we're not spring chickens anymore, right? And so sometimes we have a little memory issue every now and again. And have you ever met somebody out of context where if you knew them, if you saw them in a place where you're used to seeing them, you could, oh, I know your name, everything about you, da-da-da. But let's say you're in the grocery store in the frozen food aisle and they walk up, and because you're not in the context that you're accustomed to, you can't remember their name. And you feel so embarrassed, and you're sitting there going, oh my God, I've known them for 20 years and now I can't think of her name. It was this. These beings are standing in front of me and I'm going, oh my gosh, I'm supposed to know. I know you. I know who you are, but I couldn't recall how. And they very patiently waited. All the time in the world. And they waited and they waited lovingly. And I sat there and next thing the light bulb went on. And I realized that these beings had known me from the dawn of time. They were mine. They were assigned to me. They were with me. They had followed me through everything I'd ever done. And suddenly I'm realizing everything I'd ever done had been a whole lot more than just 21 years. And, I'm remembering and I'm having all these great aha. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. That's what it felt like. Oh yeah. Oh my God. How could I have forgotten that? Oh. It was just wonderful, euphoric.
What were the beings like? Can you describe them?
Mm-hmm. They came in humanoid form because I think the shock of having just died, they would present themselves in a means that would have been most familiar to me in that moment. Humanoid as in they weren't angels. They did not have big wings. And they also weren't just a light body where you might see a beautiful pulsing light body and recognize its energy and, know it as a conscious, sentient being. They took a form and they took a human-shaped form because that was familiar to me. It didn't frighten me. It was comforting to me. And I was aware that that's probably not their, their normal appearance, but that they were doing this for me. And so when I recognized them, buddy, it was the homecoming of all homecomings. And
so briefly, they weren't so-called reptilians or mantid, big-eyed things with greys.
No.
Or reptoids.
No, they were beautiful.
Or Pleiadian blonde or what?
No, they were elderly, elderly looking, but in a comforting kind of granddad kind of way. And both were male in this case, and I was able to distinguish that they were male. And again, I think that was for my benefit. I think they were taking on a form when they didn't necessarily, permanently reside in a form that way. And so at that stage, then I started getting the great download. This was that moment when all of us who are here still in human form and thinking with a human brain who go, God, I hope when you die there's a movie. I hope somebody gets a movie and it tells everything and answers all these questions. Well, there is. And it comes in the form of this download of, oh, yes, oh, of course that's how that works. Oh, yes, this makes sense. Oh, yes, and you're remembering everything. And at that point, it was as if that atmosphere around me turned into a 360 cinema. And all of a sudden I was watching my life play out as Mary Helen. I was watching this most recent incarnation play out. I'm suddenly aware that there have been more than one incarnation. And reincarnation was certainly not something I was learning in Sunday school, So this was a brand new concept for me. I can't even say that I'd ever really entertained the word or the idea. So this was all new for me and very different than what I had been taught to believe. So they are there with me the entire time, and I'm watching 21 years unfold. And, I remember this, I'm like, ooh, that was a wonderful moment. Ooh, that was a little cringeworthy. And I'm waiting, and I do recall in that moment looking around, because in the Christian model, I had been taught to believe that when that day came, that I would sit in judgment, that I would be judged by somebody, and at that stage, my performance as a human being, would be deemed acceptable to move on to heaven or not acceptable and we go to hell, And so I'm looking around and I'm like, okay, well, where's, these guys definitely, because they were just the most loving, wonderful, accepting, you're fantastic, hi, we love you from the, the beginning of time kind of people. And I'm looking and there's nobody, and I'm looking and there's nobody, there's the big guy in the white robe and the beard, nobody. And suddenly I realized that I was actually the one critiquing my own performance. And this was kind of my own personal apotheosis, my own recognition of my own divinity. That when we hit that space, it is we who are judging our own experiences. Do I strike you as somebody who's shocked easily?
So this is your experience. So explain.
Okay, so, I'm suddenly beginning to realize my own divinity, and that each and every one of us is a piece of that divinity, and that everything I'd been taught to believe that was going to happen to me upon death, upon leaving the body, wasn't happening the way that I'd been told. It was so much bigger. And it's not that it was wrong per se, it's just that it was this as opposed to this, which was wonderful and, a very exciting thing, because what were the possibilities? So as I'm watching my own life unfold in front of me, and I would hit moments where, let's say, I didn't use good judgment, or maybe I said something that was hurtful to another, I was able to watch the magnificent snowball effect that took place and how that could change the course of another person's day, another person's life. And you became very conscious in that moment about being very careful about everything you ever do or say or think about another individual, including yourself. And it was a most wonderful experience to be able to see that and to realize that nobody was telling me that you did this wrong. It was me going, okay, if I had a do-over on that, I probably would have gone this way. So I'm watching myself learn and grow in the moment and saying, okay, if this opportunity had presented, what did that feel like? Why did I do that? Was it an altruistic move? Was I doing that for me? What was it for? And it wasn't that one was right or wrong. It was just that it was, and it was okay either way, because I had gone into the form and I'd gone into earth to experience the dichotomy of dark and light. And now in that moment, I'm realizing that this place that we call home, earth, that we're always striving for peace on earth, and we'd love to that. That's not what earth was made for. Earth was meant to be the dichotomy of dark and light. That we came here, that these valiant, wonderful souls that we are, we choose to come to this planet because so much grotesque horror and so many pristinely beautiful things can happen simultaneously. And that's the gift that earth has to offer, the evolution of a soul. And I'm sitting there going, wow, because everybody, every Miss America pageant, you'd hear them get up and say, I wish for peace on earth. And suddenly I went, oh, that's not possible. because you can have peace on earth at the same time as you can have war and horror on earth. And so when a soul is coming here and it's choosing to tie its hands behind its back and shove itself into a body that only gets 5 senses, and on top of that doesn't get to remember who it is, and is coming into this space thinking that it is the pinnacle of all creation. I mean, like, what a joke. We arrive here and think that we're it. I actually grew up believing that nothing else existed in the universe. It was God, and God took care of we earth beings, and then he sent Jesus, and, then we would evolve and move on. I didn't know there were other beings out there. And now I'm living it, I'm seeing it, I'm realizing, hang on a second. You mean there are other places beside earth? You mean that a soul chooses to come to earth to do X, Y, and Z means that there are other choices. It means that a soul can incarnate into another type of form, higher or lower vibration. So all of a sudden I'm becoming aware that this is a much bigger universe than I had believed. And that I was being supported by beings that are standing right in front of me that weren't earthly beings. This is all brand new for me and very, very exciting. So in that moment, I realized, hang on, I'm not done. I agreed to something, and I'm like, oh, I had that accident to wake myself up. I became an adult, and the best I could do was predict the score of a basketball game with what I had. I'm going back. I got stuff to do. And they were delighted. And they were supportive either way. I could have stayed, and nobody would have judged me. Nobody would have cared. I would have moved on to the next adventure. But I chose to go back. So nobody forced me. I wanted to go back and serve. I was already familiar with Mary Helen. I was already familiar with my players in my game. I was already familiar with my surroundings, where I had come from, who my family members were, the type of belief system that I had developed. And I wanted to go back in and try it differently. And so I did. And at the moment that I made that decision, that beautiful celestial music of the spheres started to get lower and lower and lower. And next thing, I'm bulleting back and breakneck speed back into the body. And when I come to, I'm on the pavement in a heap. My neck is broken. My ribs are broken. I mean, I'm deaf in one ear now at this stage. I'm freaking out because I come back in and I'm immobilized with a neck brace, and I'm on one of those boards, and I'm being placed into the back of an ambulance. As soon as I get in the back of the ambulance, I'm freaking out. And it hurt because my body was crushed. I had just come from this weightless, wonderful being of light and, this space of love and all that knowledge. And I'd stuffed myself back into, the dirty clothes again. And I started to cry, and I was, kind of wailing out. And there was a lady in the back of the ambulance, stroking my hair, going, you're okay. We're not going to let you die. And I'm looking at her going, I've already been dead, and I'm trying not to sound like a raving lunatic. So when I was in the hospital, in and out of consciousness at that stage, I remember coming to, and in walked a man in uniform, and it was a police officer, and he had a little notebook, and he came and he said the first thing, you're one lucky little lady. And I looked, and I tried to sit myself up in the bed, and I realized how much pain I was in, and I didn't realize at that moment that my neck was broken, and neither did they, because that hadn't been x-rayed, or I couldn't swallow properly, and I sounded like I had swallowed gravel, And I'm looking at him, and he looked very familiar. And it was one of those kind of Wizard of Oz moments, she's in the bed, and she's like, hello, there's, the farmer and the farmhand who was the Tin Man and all. And I'm like, am I having a freaking Wizard of Oz moment here? But I'm looking at the guy, and I'm like, no, I saw him. I know who he is. So he's asking me questions. How did this happen? What happened? What do you remember? Well, I was at the stoplight, and my light turned green, and I started across the intersection, and bam. And I'm like, you were there. You were at the accident. And he's kind of looking at me. And he's like, okay. And I said, my old college suite mate was a couple of cars behind me. She'd be great to ask because she saw the entire thing happen. And he's looking at me. And I said, and a lady came up, and she put her name and address on a piece of paper on the passenger seat of the car and then ran off. You know, see, did you find that in the car? And now he's really looking at me. And he said, young lady, there is absolutely no way that you could know that I was there. I'm the guy who took you out of the car. We're the ones who got the jaws of life to come and get the door off. I was there when you were unconscious. I was there. You were never awake. You never saw any of that. How on earth? And then both he and I realized at the same second, uh-oh, something strange is happening here. And so it was like a movie. He closed the little notebook and he was like backing out of the room. You know, he was petrified. I'd say his dinner conversation was interesting that night. And I was left sitting there in that, you know, in that emergency room going, what the hell just happened? And so the following days, you know, were very interesting because I was discharged from the hospital, strangely, with a whole bunch of undiagnosed injuries. And this is what led me, you know, I went to see a chiropractor at that stage, and he was the one who'd x-rayed my spine, found the fractures in my neck, my pelvis, you know, all of these injuries. I detached a retina. And it was like whoever was on duty that Saturday, you know, they patched me up as best they could and sent me on my way to deal with all of this. But I always, you know, I knew what had happened. I knew who I'd met. I knew this. You know, I had a boyfriend at the time who was later to become my husband at that stage. And I remember trying to tell him what happened. And the only person that, you know, that I was ever able to tell fully didn't happen until many years later. I didn't have the words. How do you describe the indescribable? So after I began to repair and I started, you know, getting myself back into shape again, these strange little things began to happen. I had been told at the time by those celestial beings that I would see signposts, that they were never going to leave me, they were always there, but that I had agreed to come back and utilize these gifts and they were going to help me. But they were also going to up the ante a little. That the gifts that I'd had before that I wasn't really doing anything with were going to be enhanced with an ability to touch somebody and download their hard drive. So I'd be able to touch somebody who'd come to me with cancer or AIDS or whatever the disease process was, or even emotional or spiritual. And basically, pardon the French, bypass their own bullshit and whatever story that they had told themselves and go in and find out the real cause of the illness. And by going in and wiping their windows clean and allowing them to see out for themselves, they would be able to find their own healing. Or if somebody was actually getting ready to experience the death process, to be able to hold their hand and walk them through it without fear. So I suddenly have the ability to do this. Well, Judge, the dead grandfather, appears one day. And remember, he was a medical doctor. And he says to me, you're going to go back to school. And I went, I just graduated from 4 years of university. I'm done. I'm not going back to school. You're going back to school and you're going to go to chiropractic school. And I'm like, chiropractic school? What? It was always we need for you to learn a philosophy of the human form, the mind, body, and spirit. We need you to learn the tripod. We don't want you to learn how to be a mechanic of the pieces and parts of the body, that if something's broken, you either try and fix it or take it out. We want you to understand the interweavings of the spiritual experience in the human form. We need for you to understand that the body is only the vehicle. We need for you to understand that, and the best place for you to do that and to gain that philosophy of vitalism as opposed to mechanism is going to be through a chiropractic education. We need, because of how you're going to be able to touch and help people, for you to know the human form. We need you to know your anatomy. We need you to know how the body operates. And rather than learning it in a medical model, we want you to learn it in a chiropractic model, because it's basic. It's fix the obvious first before you go tinkering and pulling things out and, you know, drugging somebody up. Allow the spirit the opportunity to have the experience in the form that it came here to experience. And sometimes disease is just that. It's not always the enemy. It's something that somebody is bringing into the life in order to experience something that they need for their own growth and evolution. So next thing you know, I'm going to chiropractic school, completely unexpectedly. And so I do this and I go, and of course now I understand once I'm in there, I'm touching people all the time. So this new enhanced ability to touch someone is coming to fruition because now I'm able to use it. Now I've got the excuse to have my hands all over people 24/7. And, after 20 years of practice and, at least 150,000 patients at this stage, I've had my hands on so many people that I'm able to easily use and read that ability. Now I don't practice any longer and just do the healing sessions full time. I completely 100% trust my ability to do that because it's all I do. And so it was fascinating that this was my experience in exiting the form and coming back in and remembering my purpose. So I've had the opportunity to talk to a whole lot of other near-deathers over the years, through teaching, workshops, seminars, lecturing. And what's interesting is I seem to have quite a bit more recollection for some reason of what happened to me than an awful lot of people do. They will come back in and they'll describe this indescribable feeling of love. When really in the end, that's really all that matters, isn't it? But they'll talk about the feeling of love, and it was this homecoming, and it was comfortable. But I remember all these details. I remember what I saw, who I saw, what they told me, how it works out there, how it works here. And I knew that part of my mission here was to write about that, talk about that, in order to get people to let themselves off the hook, to get rid of the fear, and also to expose, for whatever reason at this point in history, how this planet actually operates. And so throughout all this time, I always heard voices, not schizophrenic types of voices, but voices that would come in and give guidance. And I had many experiences where these voices would help me alter or change a situation. They would tell me something was going to happen. I would do that. They'd guide me along the way, and then there would be, this outcome. And one day, I got tired of just hearing the voices, and I said, listen, I signed up. I went through this whole experience. I agreed to come back. I need to see what's happening. I need to see who you are. And this was my first face-to-face meeting with a group that I call the Council. And the Council, COUNCIL, is more to me like Council, COUNSEL, Council. And this group of beings, there were 9 at first. And when I saw them, it was, they who went through in very, very detailed descriptions. It was they who gave me the complete understanding of how I had orchestrated on a soul level for this accident to take place. And it was they that I was working for, more or less. So, when this idea that we're taught about God, and there's, okay, we're all stewards of God, and, God's a feeling. People expect this being to be sitting there, and there's this throne, and there's this, whatever God is God an alien, is God a, this miraculous being, and they were expecting a single being, and that's not what God is. That's how God can be in many places at one time, because God is a feeling. That feeling that when I entered that space, that entered every course of my being, that feeling of belonging, that feeling of knowing my own divinity, knowing that I was a piece of God and that we all are, that's what God is. So there are many things that work for that source, work for that feeling. And the Council is one of these many groups. And so those of us who come back to Earth that are tasked with some, mission in order to maybe raise consciousness, save the environment, whatever our particular thing is. A lot of people don't remember who they work for. I just happen to remember and have regular contact with. So now you take the little girl, Southern Baptist out of the Bible Belt, who's now working with celestial beings. So I had this great understanding, as my father described one of the beings, and it turns out it was one of the members of my council who visited my father. And now I'm looking at 9 beings sitting in front of me who each are representing wherever they come from, and none of them look like me. 3 were blue. Some have a more, it's hard to even describe because we don't have anything here that looks like that. You'd like to go, one looks like a fish, and you hear about reptilians or the grays with the big eyes. It's because we don't have words to describe. And people think that that's, what do you mean? And I saw something the other day that really knocked this one home for me. And it was a video somebody had put up on YouTube about a new discovery for people with color blindness. And someone has created glasses that someone who's colorblind all their life can put these glasses on, and it corrects the color blindness. So they're showing the video through the eyes of what it looks like for somebody who's colorblind. There's red, orange, green, blue balloons sitting here, and they all look kind of just pale and muted. And then the person puts the glasses on, and you're watching their first reaction. Oh my God, is this what the rest of you see? This has been in front of me all the time. They had no idea. Now they're still seeing the same as the next person, but their perception of what they're seeing is completely altered when they put these glasses on. So I liken it to that. You know, just because people can't remember or can't see things the way that I can doesn't mean it's not there. I'm blessed. Some days maybe I feel cursed, but blessed to see the world and have that connection with that other side and those who are out there. You know, and I operate everything that I do based on that. Everything that I do, every decision I make, every person that I assist, every word that I write in my books, everything is with their guidance, because I'm working on their team. And my team, that team, is working on raising consciousness and reducing fear. Because the planet as it is set up now is one that's very fear-based. There's also a lot of love here. But that dichotomy of dark and light that we discussed before has become so big, and the separation so huge, that I was then made aware that things aren't exactly the way that we think they are here, and that a whole lot of very wonderful beings play a very large role in making sure that planet Earth is what it is. And this, of course, blew my mind, you know, because not only did I have to come back from a near-death experience and all the things that followed, you know, using these gifts and seeing things and having these wonderful visits and all, I didn't just come back into life. I had to come back in and recreate my entire paradigm. My whole paradigm had shifted, because what I had thought was so was completely not so. And I'm still here, I'm still walking around, I'm still functioning in this reality, but I'm just doing so with a conscious recollection and a daily contact with those who don't look like you and I. So are they out there? Are they real? Oh my gosh. Are they what? And I have had more experiences than any video would ever give us time for, that I could tell you that would reinforce that. So are we close to the 20? Because there's a story I'd love to share with you.
Well, we'll do that on a complete bit, so let's pause for this.
Okay.
We'll have a quick smoke break or whatever, and we'll
So when I was in my last year of chiropractic school, and had gone on and was, you know, learning to utilize these gifts and getting used to the voices and, you know, the interaction with this council, a strange thing happened. You know, I had mentioned before that I had a boyfriend at the time of the accident. We had married subsequently, and he was a really good sport. He really was. But it all got to be a bit much. You know, as you can well imagine, I'm having, you know, now regular out-of-body experiences. I'm speaking with people who nobody else can see. I'm getting called out in the middle of the night to go to the hospital to help somebody pass. You know, like, what do you say to the marriage counselor? You know, is she cheating on you? Well, not with somebody in a body, you know. And so that marriage came to an end. So I found myself, I was living in the house doing my last year of school, and I had a roommate come in, and he was very interesting. And one night he came home and he said, do you mind if I have a psychic party? And I said, a what? And a psychic party. And I said, yeah, knock yourself out. I was working anyway. I was working in a chiropractic office in a health food store, so I wasn't going to be home till late. So I get home that evening and, you know, find there's a little group of people sitting in my sitting room, and then in the front sitting room there was Psychic Susie, you know, and people were going in and having their readings. And funny enough, for all the strange experiences I'd ever had, I had never come face to face with a psychic. I'd never felt so inclined. I never felt like I needed to. It wasn't a curiosity. I was like, I don't need anybody to tell me anything else. And so I went on back to my bedroom, and next thing I hear this knock on the door, and he said, she wants to see you. And I said, why does she want to see me? And he said, just go, just do it. Well, I go in, and I'm sitting toe-to-toe with this psychic who's telling me, you're going to be traveling abroad. I had like 2 cents in my bank account at that stage. You're going to be traveling abroad, and something's been happening to you. Oh, very interesting, You've been seeing something that are actually a light switch. And I said, what do you mean a light switch? And she said, something that your soul set up for itself to move you to the next step, just so you wouldn't forget. And I said, okay. And she goes, these are symbols. You've been seeing symbols. Well, I nearly fell out of my chair because I had for months at that stage been seeing symbols. And I told absolutely no one. I did not tell my roommate. I didn't.
What type of symbols?
So I could be eyes open, eyes closed, and I would see 3 at a time, and they looked like some kind of weird ancient alphabet. And as soon as I would write down or commit to memory the next 3 would come, and there ended up being 21 in total. And nobody knew. And of course, because I guess they think I'm a ditzy blonde, they came in flaming orange, so I wouldn't miss the point. And I'm seeing these symbols now for months on end. And she says, these are the beacon that are calling you to your next destination. You'll be traveling abroad, and you'll be living abroad. And I'm like, not a chance, At this stage, I have a new boyfriend. He's from Philadelphia. We're already organizing to go. We're moving to Philadelphia to set up our chiropractic practice and all. Nah. Man plans, they laugh. So, sure enough, I get this call from the chiropractic school in England who says, you're the president of the student body of your chiropractic school, and we'd love to invite you over to speak. Now I'm going abroad all of a sudden with 2 cents in my pocket. And I go, and during that trip, I end up coming to Ireland. And I set foot in Ireland, and I knew with such certainty that this was my next place. This was where I was to come. And in the course of that trip, I was with a friend from home, and we were traveling around Ireland, and I was always in pursuit of these symbols, because these are burned into my brain at this stage. And so there was a fellow who was acting as a tour guide for us, and he was driving us around the country that we'd met in a pub, as you do in Ireland, and he said, oh, I'd be delighted to show 2 American girls around. And of course we trusted him and went with him. It ended up working out well, thank God. But we're in the village of Lisdoonvarna, and the guy says to me, he goes, I have to tell you, you are the strangest girl I have ever met. He goes, you're always looking around for something. What in the world is going on? He's like, you're acting so weird. Every place that I take you, you're looking. What is it you're looking for? So I finally confessed, and I said, all right, this is here's me, and here's what I do. And I know this is going to sound odd, and but it's these symbols, and I know they're here somewhere. And he's like, hold on a second. And he goes over, or actually, he had bought a little token ring for me and for my friend, thanks for bringing me along on your trip, whatever. He put the ring on my finger, and I looked down, and one of the symbols was on the ring. That's how it happened. And I freaked out, and he was like, what is it? What is wrong with you? Why are you so strange? And I'm like, where'd you get this ring? So he took me back to the shop, and then we went through a tray of rings. Not another ring had the symbol on it. And so that's when I explained to him the whole story about the symbols and all. And he goes, why didn't you tell me this in the beginning? Get into the car. So we get into the car. We're on this side of the country, and we drive like mad all the way across country. It is now, and of course it's Ireland in the summertime, so it's light at 11 o'clock at night. We arrive outside of Newgrange. And Newgrange, Neolithic tombs. You're familiar with Newgrange, I know. And so, of course, it's way past closing time, and it's dark, and I'm getting ready to leave Ireland the next day, and I'm sitting here, and the hair is standing on my neck, and he's told me that I might find some of these symbols. And he's like, come on, you only live once. And I'm like, running through the fields. There's dogs barking. There's farmers coming out, you know. And we proceed to break into a national monument by jumping the fence. And I'm standing outside the tomb looking at the curbstones, and there are some of the symbols. Well, I nearly fell to my knees and just went, that's one of them, yeah. And nearly fell to my knees, and I was like, oh my God, this is it. Here I am. So the symbols had in fact led me here. Well, it turns out that they are what's called the Goet alphabet. And the Goet is a pre-Atlantean alphabet. It's the earliest alphabet so far that we know of on planet Earth.
Explain. This is really, really important.
So the Goet alphabet is actually holographic. The symbols in their day were actually interlocking symbols that would create a hologram that would project like an entire library of knowledge. And the Goet alphabet actually held the history of the world to date. Okay? So from the time I'd been 5 years old, I had my first past life flashback. And that flashback was standing, watching the sky fall apart, basically. Watching flaming asteroids, watching bits and pieces fly through the sky. I knew in that time I was Atlantean. And Atlantean, we didn't...
Folks, this is really important. Can you really go into this?
Sure.
This is so crucial to the whole story.
Sure. So I had a flashback. I was in Virginia Beach, funny enough, where the Edgar Cayce ARE is, which I have a great affinity to. And I was 5 years old, and my parents had taken us away on a spur-of-the-moment holiday to the beach, and of course didn't book any accommodation. So we were stopping at hotel, no. Finally, we stopped at one that was beachfront. And this was at a time, 42 years ago, where the Virginia Beach coastline was eroding. So they were blasting sand in through these huge pipes. It was a big operation. So this was taking place in front of the hotel on the beach where we were. So, of course, I'm 5 years old. My parents are unloading the car. And what do? I walk straight to the ocean in the dark and want to see these pipes that are blasting sand. Well, I turned the wrong direction and I got lost. And I walked for hours and eventually come upon these two gentlemen who had a little campfire going and a little makeshift kind of stove, and they were smoking funny little skinny cigarettes. And I bounced up at 5 years old and I'm like, I've lost my parents. Can you help me? And I was so fortunate and so looked after, and they took me by the hand and they walked me. And of course, I offered up the name of every hotel we'd been turned away from. And it took hours to get back to the original hotel. And when I walked through the threshold of that door, my mother's face, and my father wasn't there because, of course, there's no cell phones at the time. He's frantically out looking for me. They think I've drowned at this stage. And when he came back in, he starts yelling at me as a concerned parent would, do you realize what you put us through and you could have drowned? And all of a sudden his voice just went blurry, he droned out. And I had my first flashback of a past life memory. And I'm standing watching these flaming asteroids go through the sky. I had a long purple dress on. I knew I was a librarian of sorts. The temple or building that I was working in, I was frantically trying to tie up loose ends because I knew I was getting ready to die. And my greatest memory from that time was the wave. There was a gigantic wall of water that came and took everybody I knew and loved and everything I knew and loved out. But my main goal was to commit to memory the symbols that I was working with at the time, which storehoused this information and the history of the world as we knew it to date. This would have been about 13,664 years ago. This was my first past life flashback. So now, fast forward, I find myself standing in Newgrange in Ireland looking at 3 of these symbols. And I'm like, oh my God. So at all costs, no matter what, I was going to be coming back to Ireland. And this is how, when people ask, did you find a boyfriend here and you moved to Ireland? No, I came here chasing ancient pre-Atlantean symbols that were bringing me on to the next step that were going to reintroduce me to my mission. So I come to Ireland, and fast forward a little bit, I get invited to a workshop in a place in Galway. Little back alley apartment had been rented out, and there's a man called Dr. Lou Graham. And Dr. Lou Graham was presenting material called Gnosis, an alternate history of the world. And myself and a friend had been invited to attend. I was actually heavily pregnant at the time, and went to this seminar, and we'd missed the first half hour because I'd had patients that morning. And I walk in and sit down, and he recaps what he's just been talking about. And he's talking about these ancient symbols, and he does this flip chart, and he flips one over, and I'm like this, and there's the first symbol in the alphabet. He flips to the second one, and there's number 2. He flips once more, and there's number 3, and now I'm like this. So in the break, he calls me up and he says, "Dr. Hensley, you know, I respect your right as a doctor, as a scientist, to disagree with this material, and I can tell by the look on your face that I have said some things that you don't agree with." And I'm going, no, you've got it all wrong. Where did you get those? And he says, you know, well, these are the first 3 symbols in a pre-Atlantean alphabet called Goet. And I'm like, did you know that there are more? And he said, of course I do. I've spent my entire career looking for them. And I'm like, oh, I've got them in my handbag. You know? And thus began my relationship with Dr. Lou Graham. And Dr. Lou Graham has written, you know, his book now called Gnosis. He was featured with Graham Hancock with his material because, again, we go way back. We're going back a minimum of 13,500 years. And so this is the origin of these symbols. And so it's these symbols that brought me here to Ireland. So before, when we were speaking, I mentioned my introduction to the council that I worked with and that there were 9. Well, initially there were 9, and then the last 3 appeared. So there were 12 in total. And the 3 that appeared with me, you know, introduced themselves to me on a particular visit. They looked different than the rest of them, and they looked far more familiar than the rest of them. And they identified themselves as Arcturian. So my Arcturian friends and I seem to have a great affinity. And so when they identified themselves to me, and I realized that they were head of my group. So my council of 12, which sat 9 other types of beings, the 3 chief proponents of my group, I guess, were Arcturian. And upon meeting them, I recognized my own connection and background with that because it was just overwhelmingly familiar. And so I have found over the years that when in distress, it is they who arrive. And I had a particular situation where I was having really, really difficulties with my stomach, my gallbladder. I was having a lot of trouble. I was quite ill. And
was this an energetic thing?
This was a physical thing, a real physical issue.
Yeah, that's where a lot of meridians comes from.
Yeah, and you'll find a lot of people who have the same kind of ability that I have issues with hiatal hernia, with gallbladder, liver. That particular line seems to be an entry point, you know, energetically for people who are dealing outside of the 5 senses. And I've seen too much of it not to know that that's real.
Again, I have another colleague, very similar. That's why it ties in.
Yeah. So I was having major issues with this, and one night I wake up in the bed, and I had, at first I wasn't sure whether I was dreaming or whether I was awake, but there were 2 beings. They were blue, they were Arcturian, and they're actually quite beautiful. They're, if you could picture, did you ever see the movie Avatar? Did you see Avatar?
Yeah.
Okay, you know they were blue. Okay, so picture kind of a more pale type of blue, and they were hairless. They didn't have, they were humanoid looking, between 7 and 8 feet tall. Very beautiful, beautiful creatures. And in this dream that I think I'm having, I distinctly remember getting 2 pinpricks, and it was like I was being injected with something. And I was like, ooh, how interesting. Well, next thing, I'm being shot off somewhere, and they are with me, and we arrive in this beautiful kind of tropical, and it's on Earth place. And now I really have the feeling that I'm there. It's not like a dream type situation. I'm there. And they're with me. And I'm looking at this plant, and there's this very distinct waterfall that's casting a rainbow behind it. It was beautiful. And there's this plant there, and the plant is white, and they explained to me that this plant is what I'm going to be using to help heal myself. And I'm like, oh, how interesting. And it was white, and it had this long kind of shoot that came off of it. And I was like, okay, that's interesting. And next thing, whoosh, we're gone. And we're in Africa. And we were in a shanty village that was absolutely riddled with drug use, riddled. And I'm standing there, but nobody could see me, but I could see them. And the two beings are there, nobody can see them either. And they take this little concoction, and there's a guy who is completely strung out. No shoes, you know, I can see the shirt he's wearing right now, the tattered jeans, a kind of a plaid shirt, filthy, and they pull him up, and he's actually, in appearance to everybody else, just lifting up because nobody can see the blue men. And they drip this into his mouth. Well, next thing, immediately his eyes go from yellow to white. And they took this strange piece of paper and put it on the ground. It was like litmus paper. And they stood him on top of it, and the paper went black. And what they were showing me, that was what they had put into his mouth, had instantaneously detoxed him. And I'm like, oh my God, this is strange. So I get up the next morning and I'm like, God almighty, what kind of a dream was that? Whew. I go into the bathroom, I'm getting ready to get into the shower, and I look down, and the two pricks that I had felt weren't just something I had conjured, they were on my body. And suddenly I become very aware of what's taken place. And it turns out that what they had shown me was, it's called cat whiskers is the flower, and it's used to make Java tea. And the Java tea in its pure form is actually an extraordinarily strong detox. And I used it to clear out what was happening with the gallbladder and stomach, and it healed me. It cured that ailment. And so I would have frequent interactions with them. And what's interesting was I asked, okay, what's the deal with the pinpricks? You know, because there's an element of, okay, have I been violated here? Did that happen against my will? What's going on? You know, but it didn't feel like that, because what they were doing with me was helpful. So the way they explained it was that the pinpricks and what they had to put into me prepared me for travel. That this body was incapable of traveling the way that they could. And the only way that could happen was if I was pricked this way. So I have, over the years, and it's always in two. It looks like a snake bite nearly, and it happens on different parts of the body. And
always 2 bites.
Always 2.
And what do they put in?
Whatever is in this concoction that allows my physical form to move.
I know there are restrictions on the present human body on doing that, unless something else happens.
So that's how they describe that. So people, I would say, who've been abducted, you know, or whatever their experience, I've never had a negative experience with that. So I would be on the other end of that spectrum, where my experience with anybody who's not of this world has always been quite positive. You know, I have the odd story of things that have been, you know, not so desirable, but that's not where my focus and attention lies.
I think there's been an over-concentration on the negative, but this is the whole point of this, is to get the positive.
So, you know, because they are on my team, and, you know, they want me to see things, and also because they want me to share things with the world, you know, that's why I write that I do, you know, what I do. I put my neck on the line, and, you know, where I'd like to, you know, you have your healers, and you have people who do angels, and you do things that fit inside of people's box. Healing that really works for people because they can digest it in their paradigm.
To be frank, we come up to the closing part of part 3. To be honest, the Christian thing that in this part of Europe is being pretty boxed in. Yeah. With a lot of fear. Yeah. A lot of things pretty not right.
And I'm looking at them now going, you guys, you know, you're talking about fear. You have got to be joking me if you actually think that we would still be here without somebody helping us. And what I know is, where we hear the negativity about, you know, the reptilians and the greys and all this, there are so many incredibly wonderful beings who are on a 24/7 daily basis assisting us to remain here so that we can continue having our experience. We have been blocked from, you have no idea what we've been blocked from.
Well,
that
let's
would...
take a little pause on that. I know time is short, but let's concentrate on that in the
Okay.
next part. Okay?
All right.
That's really important.
You know, so it was interesting. When I wrote my first 3 books, and then they were condensed into the book that Simon & Schuster has now, which is called Promised by Heaven, I fought very hard for my epilogue. And my epilogue was important because, you know, I told, you know, this wonderful tale of, you know, the car accident and what happened when I died and came back, and so, you know, things that give people a lot of hope, and you know, explain what it's like to go through the death process. It gives, you know, comfort to people who've lost people maybe in, you know, more tragic circumstances, and knowing that it's possible to be out of the body before tragedy strikes, and you know, sharing all of these stories, and that I'm a very real person, you know, that I've had my ups and downs. I've financially been way up, and I've crashed, and, you know, I've had people who've loved me and left me, and, you know, I've lived a very exciting and fulfilling and horrible and wonderful human existence.
No, but this is, a lot of people haven't been able to get through their experiences. You are clearly through understanding and fully cognitive, and you're coming up with an amazing view on this, a depth of experience with conclusions and solid information. Well,
you know, I think one thing that really helped me was I made an agreement with those 2 beings upon returning into my body, and to call it like it is, I said, I got one condition. I will go back and do everything that you want me to do and serve in any way possible. I will write as many books. I will do as many movies. I will do whatever you take. But one thing, I cannot give a shit what people think about me. And I have been very blessed for all of these years to genuinely, from the bottom of my soul, wish to serve, wish to share, but I couldn't care less what somebody thinks about me, if they think that I'm nuts or whatever. And this gets back to my epilogue in the book. And I had told this story, and, you know, I remember the editor saying to me, you sure you really want to put this epilogue in? Because, you know, you've told this, and, you know, it's a big stretch for people to believe anyway, and they're grasping onto this idea of everybody loves the life after death thing, and they want to hear a positive story, and this, but now you're kind of stepping outside. And this epilogue talks about the fact that I work with a council. So now all my Christian readers go, what? Aliens? Are we talking about aliens? What is this council? Do you know? And I would not dream of giving people just what they want to hear, because I am about the truth. And my truth might be different than their truth in their current circumstances.
Yeah, I think we must respect people's...
Absolutely.
People have different positions and abilities.
And they have different...
You've got to bring them all along.
Different perspectives, exactly. So I felt like I couldn't do lip service to my own truth. So in this epilogue, I discussed the council, and I discussed the fact that with every crazy bone in my body, I know beyond a shadow of a doubt that we are being helped every single day, and that we wouldn't be here and be able to have the experience in this beautiful, you know, wonderful, strange place that we live in without their assistance. We have been shielded that many times from, you know, things colliding with this planet. We have been shielded that many times from destroying ourselves. I mean, civilizations in the past have risen and fallen and destroyed themselves many times, but we've never managed to wipe ourselves out completely. There's a reason for that. And there are those who are here who are helping us along in that experiment. And who are we? Well, we're all hybrids of who they are, do you know? Do you really, 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 really believe that we came to this planet and just the sperm and the egg came together and the loving soul came from God and came in, and that's it, and that's the end of it, and that is the height or pinnacle of God's creation? That's just not how it works. Do you know? And I think this is far more exciting. Do you know? I think it's wonderful to know that there is somebody out there, and there's always balance. So for as much good, there's as much evil or negativity. But the most extraordinary thing happened to me in 2012. And I'd actually just lost my father. I was over in Glasgow at a workshop with Wayne Dyer, Anita Morjani, Louise Hay. And there was a lady who was a friend of the lady that I was there with. And she was very, very interesting. And she invited us to meet her for dinner. And we did, and we walked up to the table, and she'd already ordered before we'd gotten there. And she had this big steak, and it was dripping off the sides of the plate, and this big old glass of wine. And she looked like your granny. She was in her early 80s. She had on a cardigan and a nondescript t-shirt, you know, that had a little food stain here, and had her little trousers on, and she was just full of the joys. And she laughed, and she supped on that wine and dug into that steak, and she was just thoroughly enjoying life. And she pats the seat next to her, and she said, "Come here and sit down." And she said, "We've been really interested in what you've been doing." There's that we again, like my grandfather used to talk. Who is we? Who are we? Who are we talking about? And I said, okay. And she said, I want to put something into your hand. I want you to close your eyes. And I closed my eyes, and this weighty thing went into my hand. And she said, "Don't open your eyes." And she goes, "Tell me what you feel about this." And instantly, the minute she put it in my hand, it didn't feel like anything I've ever felt here. I said, "It's not from this planet." And she said, "Correct." And I'm feeling around, and it's round. And she goes, "I want you to look down, open your eyes." And I looked down, and I was holding this disc about this thick, about that big around. And she goes, "Have a closer look." And I looked down, and I was dumbfounded, because around the outer perimeter of this disc were my symbols. And I'm just like, all right, okay, you know about the symbols. And she just started to laugh. And she said, "I'm going to fill you in on something because it's time." And I said, okay. And she said, "How do you actually think this world works?" And I said, "That's a loaded question. You know, what do you mean?" And she said, "Well, how do you think there can be so much good and so much bad all at the same time?" She goes, "You've been introduced to that concept many times." I said, "Yes." And she goes, "How do you think it's carried out?" And I said, I'm not sure what you're getting at." She said, "Let me tell you a little bit about myself. I work for a team that has been in place for a very long time on this planet, and we keep the balance here." And I went, okay. And she said, much like if you were to go on a cruise, and there were a cruise director, and you were getting on board the ship, and you wanted to have a particular experience while you were on the ship, a cruise director would be there to ensure that you were having the experience that you wanted to have while you were on this trip. I said, yes. And she goes, "Well, there's a whole bunch of us who are like cruise directors here on this planet." And I said, "What do you mean?" She goes, "Well, this can be a pretty nasty place." And I said, yes. And she said, "You know, we've got some pretty destructive weapons now. We've got some destructive thinkers. We have some people who aren't, you know, working for the light, people who aren't, you know, thinking of the well-being of others and thinking only of the advancement of themselves." And I said, yes. And she said, "But we also have some pretty amazing, wonderful people who are definitely working for the light and for the higher good and serving mankind and helping others." Yes. And she said, "How do you think that stays in balance?" And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, there's an entire team of us who work to make sure that there's just enough good and just enough evil to provide that dichotomy of dark and light that you always talk about. And we make sure that we never get to the edge where we completely destroy ourselves. And we also make sure we never get to the edge where there's ever world peace. Because the souls that are coming here on this cruise and are coming here for this experience have come here for the dichotomy of dark and light. And someone has to ensure that that happens. And there are some of us who are in human form, just like you, who ensure that this takes place. And we work with people who aren't in human form. We work with beings who aren't from Earth, who have a very vested interest in making sure that the Earth Project goes according to plan. And I sat there with my mouth agape as she took another big hit off her wine and big piece off of her steak. And once again, on that day in 2012, my entire paradigm shifted. And she kept up with me through email, and she would send me little messages. "Keep your eyes on London. Keep your eyes on so-and-so. Keep your eyes on Syria." And what she did in her 81-year-old body that looked like anybody's grandma, who she could get into any country she wants to because she looks completely harmless. And she described herself as a shit stirrer. And she went into Syria, and she would go and she would congregate the women together, and she'd stir the pot and cause an uprising and cause the next flare up that would create the next series of events, that the next group would come in that would be highs and lows and these dynamic experiences. And I'll never forget the day about 2 years later when I got an email from a friend of hers saying that she was coming out of an airport in Syria and had been run over by a black SUV. So my world, my perspective of how all of this operates completely changed. Every day it completely changes because I have direct communication with people who aren't from this world. So I believe that with all of my heart. I'm not crazy. I carry on with a normal job. I make school lunches for my children every day. I take out the trash. I feed my dogs. I also talk to dead people. I write books. I do a lot of really interesting things. But my life revolves around knowing that I've got one foot in that world and one foot in this world. And I'm trying to constantly keep my own balance in order to help people escape the fear that this is all there is. Because really, when it boils down to, I think a lot of people are afraid that this experience means nothing in the end and that we cease to exist and that nobody is helping us and that where is God when we need him? Do you know where? And trying to get across the point to people that, you know, we're already divine creatures. Those of us who have come to this planet have come here because we're still learning, we're still growing. We chose to be here. And we chose to come here knowing that we had the assistance of those who weren't from this place. But one of the agreements that we make when we come here is that we get that veil of forgetfulness. We forget that because that's part of the excitement of having your hands tied behind your back and only having 5 senses to deal with. And we work ourselves through the maze, through that matrix, and find our way out again. So my perspective on life and what's good and just and true is probably a lot different than most people's. And I recognize that I have the privilege, and it is a privilege, of knowing that we're not alone. Because an awful lot of people walk through this world feeling like they are completely on their own, and nobody is. No matter how low, no matter how dark, nobody is on their own. Everyone has those divine loving beings that I met when I had my experience. But sometimes part of the experience that they have written for themselves to have here on earth is to know what it feels like to completely separate from that which we come from. I'm MaryHelenHensley.com.
Yeah, this is the advert. This is our commercial bit, okay?
My book, Promised by Heaven, is available at Simon & Schuster. It's on Amazon.com. I'm currently working on a new book now called Understanding is the New Forgiveness. And, you know, helping people to let themselves off the hook here. Because, you know, we've gotten into this horrible new agey thing of thinking that the only way to achieve enlightenment is if we're able to forgive everyone. Well, you know what? In this world, the dichotomy of dark and light, there's some things that are unforgivable. And people get very hung up on that. And they think that if they can't forgive, that they themselves can't heal. If they can understand, though, that other beings have come in to play roles that are damaging or hurtful in order for their own growth and evolution, if they can reach that point of understanding, then they too can heal and move forward and grow. And so I'm trying to use a lot of the experiences that I've had through healing sessions and through out-of-body experiences and dealing with the council in order to give people maybe a new perspective on where to go with their own growth and their own healing.
So thereby enabling them to understand the experience they're in.
Exactly, because we're at that point. It's time. We're starting to wake up. And that means that the whole Earth experience is starting to evolve into something different, which is really exciting. You know, it's like we're getting an upgrade. You know, we've been doing this thing, this dichotomy of dark and light for a really, really long time now. And now it's changing. They're upping the ante. Things are happening. You know, I have a very dear friend who just had in her field, in her farm, a craft land not that long ago in the States. And she described them as tall whites. 5 translucent, beautiful beings got out of that. And the next morning they woke up and the whole farm was surrounded by SUVs.
Are you familiar with the tall whites thing, the area of Groom Lake?
I'm not as up on it as I would like to be because it's like I'm living this reality so much from day to day that I hardly have time to go back and research where it's come from. Yeah.
The thing about Atlantis is very interesting because of the theory. A friend of mine wrote a book called Ireland, Land of the Pharaohs, but crucially it's because here they re-civilized after the Great Catastrophe, and there were some commentators suggesting we're heading towards that, a repeat of that catastrophe. What happened then was, because there was a lot of ice, there was a lot of flooding, but on this one we may be able to survive it better. But crucially it's here, these islands, obviously the geography of the world changed a lot when that happened.
It did indeed, and it will change again.
What is your reason? Do you be the Atlantean symbols? What can we learn from that? Is there anything we can learn from what you said about that in today's world? Newgrange is the centre of the Battle of the Boyne, a ritual which caused so many problems here.
Right.
It wasn't a battle, it was a programming by predatory ET that's causing us problems. Yes or no?
Not too far off. That's why everything is so exquisitely lined with the universe. You know, that's not by chance. You know, that things that primitive man, as primitive as he was, you know, which is ridiculous. You know,
I mean, there's new stuff coming about Stonehenge and stuff. Long-skulled people.
Absolutely, totally, of course, yeah. The world is not what we've been taught to believe that it is. You know, even off the coast of Ireland, there was for many years, up until the 1600s, there was an island off the west coast of Ireland called High Brazil.
Yes.
Do you know? And High Brazil was very
Where
much
was
so.
That? Exactly. Southwest Cork, Kerry.
It would be more kind of, if you're looking.
Dingle.
If Galway is here and you're coming out this way towards the Dingle Peninsula here, directly off, almost like a Bermuda Triangle.
Is that where Rockall would be?
No, it's further out.
Rockall is, right.
Yeah, further out. And so it was mapped up until the 1600s, and then it just was gone, you know. There are so many places. And see, I've also, because I do healing sessions for a living with people, do you know, I've had so many people that you wouldn't even believe who've come in and spoken to me about different experiences, you know, and it's very real for them. And, you know, there's been too many for it not to be real.
The graffiti on that ship said, the key to the UFO phenomena, it didn't say that, just the key to UFOs lies in Cork Harbour. So there's a lot of secrets here. It's a mysterious place.
A lot of secrets everywhere, you know, a lot of secrets everywhere. But personally, I came back, I think part of revisiting Ireland is I think that geography will change again, and within the next couple of 100 years. And I don't think Ireland will be the same as it, you know, just the same as you see different islands around the world are beginning to change and shift. Ireland won't be the Ireland that we know now. And I think in this incarnation, I really wanted to spend time here while it still looked like this. I wanted to come also and glean as much information from there so that it was stored collectively in my consciousness, so that when the time came that Ireland didn't look the same, that if ever, you know, when I return here, that I have that knowledge, that I have that. I've always been a librarian, always been a, you know, a keeper of knowledge. And so that's why this remains such a fascinating place, because there is so much activity here, and there always has been in the past.
Yes.
But that time is coming to a close here, you know, and it'll move on to other places as the geography actually changes here, you know, and that'll be due to flooding and water rising. And, you know, it won't happen like in some kind of epic Hollywood movie in one fell swoop. It's not like the cataclysm that was caused by an exploding supernova. The one I described in the, you know, in the Atlantean throwback, that was a supernova that exploded. That's how we got the moon we have today. You know, a chunk of planet, you know, there used to be 11 in this solar system. And a chunk of planet was dragged through, and by the time it had weakened and gotten pulled into Earth's gravitational field, we have the moon that we have now. So I do not believe that the moon is a hollow, you know, man-made thing. I do believe, though, that it's a chunk that came from that last cataclysm, and it's also changed the weather patterns that we have, because prior to that time, you could sail from one end to the world completely uninterrupted. That's why there was an exchange of information that was so easy. We didn't have the tides. We didn't have the huge weather storms. We didn't have all of that, because the moon that belonged to this planet was much, much smaller. It was subsequently destroyed in that cataclysm, and we end up with the moon we have now. It's beautiful to look at, but it changed the entire atmosphere of the Earth.
It sounds like maybe there's more to talk about here.
Always.
Yes, absolutely fascinating, Mary. I really am fascinated. It's tremendous that you've done this, and also thank you for adding to this, putting this together, Catherine.
Well, I'm so grateful to be
you've really
here.
done a tremendous work, and I think we can call that a close. If you need to.
Yeah, thanks very much. I appreciate it.
And blessings and thank you. I'll put this together. I think it's going to be basis 64. We got another interview coming. It's just really a blessing. Thank you
Thank you
for visiting the Basis Project.